Welcome everyone, and welcome to our King 4 Ask the Experts. I'm very pleased to welcome you on this nice chilly Joburg day to this event. I've been looking forward to it, and I think you will enjoy it as much as I will. So King 4 was launched in 2016, and since the release of the King 4 report, a lot has happened. A lot of developments have taken place within the governance landscape, both locally and globally. There's been changes or proposed changes to the Companies Act. There's been restructuring within global reporting standards, and the impact of the Zondo Commission reports all those factors have raised questions with regards to King 4, how it is applied, how it is disclosed, and other factors that relate to these developments. So today we have put together a fantastic panel. I don't think you could get a better one if you tried, to answer your questions on all matters relating to King 4. Oops, there we go. Stopping my share. I want to introduce to you my panel. I'll start off with Ansi Romalo. She is chair of the King Committee. She is an IODSA governance specialist, a chartered director, and a professional non-executive director. Welcome, Ansi. Richard, if you'd like to turn your camera on, Richard's next. He's a member of the King Committee, a chartered governance practitioner, chartered director, and a professional independent non-executive director and chairman in some respects. And lastly, Mohammed, if you would turn your camera on for me. Mohammed is the Deputy Chair of the King Committee and a member of the Integrated Reporting Committee of South Africa, a member of the Integrated Reporting Committee's working group. So welcome to everybody. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few ground rules for everyone. You will know by now that the chat function is where we all talk and chat to each other and pass comments and contribute to the conversation from the sideline. Remember to keep it polite and keep it non-personal and constructive. If you would like to raise a question to our panel, please pop it into the Q&A. The Q&A function will be seen by all the panelists, and we will take your questions there. Okay, I think we should kick off and start with a question just to sort of set the context. And I'm going to ask Ansi, if you don't mind, you are mute, just in case you jump in before unmuting yourself. In a nutshell, can you explain to us what King 4 is about? Just for those who are familiar but not 100% sure, and who is the King Committee?
Oh, thank you, Julie. I like this question always because I think the King Committee story is such a good news story, and those are in short supply these days. So I like talking about this. The King Committee is fairly unique. It started off as an imitation, I suppose, of what was done in the UK with the Capri Committee. As the Capri Committee, the King Committee was convened simply as a committee. It started drafting King 4, and from its inception, it involved not only directors and business in its drafting, but also union representatives or people at least with those skills. It started dealing with ethical considerations, which also made it different from the Capri report. And then the other point of divergence is, whereas the Capri report disbanded after the issuing of their report, the King Committee remained in force and is in force until this day, 30 years later. And we remain a committee. We're not a regulatory body, but the standards, the guidance issued by the King Committee has unbelievable credibility. And yes, we have to thank for it the fact that the King guiding standards are supported by institutions like the JSE, like the Auditor General, like Treasury, and BUSA, but we are incredibly proud of the journey that we've traveled and how much credibility the King Committee has. So I will get to the detail as to King 4, why we did it and what we're trying to achieve. But for now, we are on a continuous journey to try and improve what we're doing and to improve at least the guiding standards for corporate governance in South Africa. Internationally, I can just mention that the King Committee and the King reports are lauded for how progressive we are in our viewpoints. Just one small example is how we have been talking about the triple bottom line and sustainability since King 2, which was issued in 2002. The rest of the world, if I may say so, is catching up now with ESG and sustainability. So King Committee and the King Report really a trailblazer.
Thanks, Ansi. As such an effective corporate governance code, we know that it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. I know it's in the JSE listing rules and otherwise, but I would like to know, and I'd like to pose this question to Mohammed, why don't we legislate King 4 to improve governance? Mohammed?
Thanks, Julie, and afternoon to everyone. So if we start with what is the fundamental principle of King, it's in essence, it's about effective and ethical leadership. And it's about outcomes that energy directs you towards. So the first difficulty is, how are you going to legislate for things like that? But if we just park that thought for a moment, let's look at what has been happening around us. If we look at the Zondo Commission, for example, a part of what they were examining is to what extent the failures that we experienced were as a result of policy or regulatory vacuum, or was it process, or was it the failure of people? Now, I suppose the answer would be in measure all of these, but if you look at the dominant issue, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. If you look at the dominant issue, we're looking at a situation where people fail to do what they should have done. Failure of accountability and failure of personal ethics. So let's take any SOE as an example. Let's take Eskom as an example. You have the Constitution. You have the Public Finance Management Act. You have Promotion of Access to Information Act. You have the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. You have the Protected Disclosures Act. You have the Companies Act that imposes on directors certain duties and obligations and fiduciary responsibilities. Within all of that, you still see that the failures that have happened. And the single problem is that there was a lack of accountability and a lack of ethical leadership. So what other legislation will we bring into force, given that with all this array of legislation, we have all the tools and all the armory that we need to have firstly prevented what has happened. What happened is unlawful, and you have enough there to prosecute people. Of course, there are areas where you can improve certain things, that you can strengthen certain parts of the legislation, but the big fault line was not an absence of regulation. The big fault line was an absence of ethical and effective leadership.
Thanks, Mohammed. Ansi, I wanted to go back to you for a second. How does King 4 impact or help small companies? Because that's a question we often get. People would think that maybe the King 4 is applicable to JSE listed companies only, but actually the way King 4 was created, it can be applied to any size organization. We have the supplements at the back of King 4, but I wanted to ask you, how does King 4 impact or help small companies or non-profit companies? Does it align with the legislation applicable to the public sector?
So in a way, this links back to what Mohammed was explaining with regards to legislation, because if you look at King 4 and you look at legislation, King 4 is meant to provide that, firstly, that aspirational aspect and also the practical aspect. What I mean by the practical aspect is, if we go to the Companies Act, for example, you will note that the two duties, or the two main duties of directors are to act in the best interest of the company, in other words, the fiduciary duty, and then the duty of care, skill, and diligence, which is the other main duty. So that's what the legislation provides. But in order to interpret the legislation in terms of what it practically means, and that it's that gap that the code fulfills. It explains the practices behind fulfilling your fiduciary duty and your duty of care, but it's also very aspirational. So King 4 is meant to sit alongside the legislation. I suppose you can also say on top of the legislation, because it is aspirational. Now, because it's drafted in an aspirational way, what we said in King 4 is we want it to serve as guidance for smaller organizations, for non-profits, and for state-owned entities. And that means that you have to interpret King 4 and its practices within a certain context. And we actually provided guidance in the King 4 report as to how this interpretation should take place. We have supplements for state-owned entities. We have supplements for municipalities, for non-profits, for retirement funds, and for small businesses. And if you read through those supplements, they explain how King 4, which is very aspirational, could be interpreted for a context that of a smaller company, or perhaps a context, the context of operating in the public sector. We believe that it is certainly there is no difficulty in harmonizing King 4 with existing legislation, even in the public sector. So maybe the aspiration that we have in mind when we drafted King 4 maybe not aligned with the Act, but it's very seldom that there's a direct clash. The one instance where there is perhaps there is a direct a different provision in the Act is where we say in King 4 that the board should appoint the CEO. Many of the pieces of enabling legislation of state-owned entities would say that, if not all of them, would say that the shareholding minister appoint the CEO. We still believe that the board appointing the CEO is the better practice, but then in our supplement for state-owned entities, we explain how we believe the spirit that sits behind the board appointing the CEO should give expression in the context of state-owned entities. And in short, what we basically say is that the board should be consulted and should give input in the appointment of the CEO, and it should be very clear right from the outset that the CEO accounts to the board, and then the board accounts to the shareholder. The CEO does not account directly to the shareholding minister. So that's just one example of how we deal with the harmonizing the legislation and King 4.
Thanks, Ansi. Richard, can we bring it back to the practicalities of it? I wanted to ask you, which board committee do you feel or should provide the oversight on corporate governance? have we overcomplicated committee structures in supporting the board? That's a question that's come up once before. Would you mind giving us your thoughts on that?
I think if you look at the board and committee structures and you look at the evolution, earlier on you heard about Cadbury and the evolution of from that governance code, and that's really where you started to see the evolution of committees, audit committees, and then nomination committees. To answer your question directly, when you talk about oversight for governance, we're talking about the structure of the organization, and depending on the committees, one would normally find that residing within the nomination and governance committee, providing it has been given that remit in its terms of reference. So that's one angle or one committee that could be looking at it. In a number of organizations, you may not have, particularly in the public sector, they don't typically have a nominations committee. So you would look for a home in one of the other committees. Or, Ansi was talking about SMEs, maybe you only have one committee, or you don't have any committees. So again, that function would move or elevate right up to board level. So if you have a look at a governance function, so to speak, as long as it is taken care of by either the board or the relevant committee, again, playing to this whole concept of proportionality, how big is your company? King is very flexible in the principle concerning committees. It gives recommendations of perhaps 4 or 5 committees, like the audit and risk committee. You then consider, do you want to split the audit committee and the risk committee? Nominations and governance committee, a REM committee or human capital committee, the social and ethics committees. You may be driven by legislation as well that says thou shalt have a SEC or thou shalt have an audit committee. So in that way, you subject to the legislation and you don't have any latitude. As I say, you have to have an audit committee, have to have an SEC. What else could we build into those committees? In a large organization, I would say it's always easier in some senses to apply governance relatively easily, because you perhaps have a larger board, you have all these defined committees. But again, just coming down to what King says. King says at principal level, you decide your support structures to support the board in the effective discharge of its duties, looking specifically at balance of power and independence. Trust that answers your just perhaps the second part of your question before I conclude. In regard to overcomplicating committees, as I say, I've spoken about proportionality, and as I say, you have the latitude to either have 5 committees or 1 or 2 committees. I think what's important, though, if you do start creating a number of committees, and you have a audit committee, a separate risk committee, a social and ethics committee, is to ensure that the terms of reference are clearly defined, and you don't replicate or duplicate within a committee which looks at a particular issue. It may be ethics, but from a different perspective. The audit committee would look at the internal controls. The risk committee would look at the risk around ethics. The social and ethics committee would look at it from an organizational perspective. That's one example. So one needs to then ensure you have the communication flow between committees and to the board. So it does become more complicated, but I default back to King is always based on what is fit for purpose for your organization. And that's where directors need to apply their minds. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Richard.
And Julie, if I may add to what Richard has said, that is the benefit of King 4 over legislation, because it is flexible. So you implement what makes sense and what will deliver you governance benefits. You don't just mindlessly comply. And therefore, in King 4, we give express permission for, as Richard has referred to, for what we call proportional application.
Thanks, Ansi. I see some questions, a question posted in the comment section, and I'm going to ask Simo to pop it over to the Q&A, but maybe one of our panelists will address it now. But it actually brings me back to one of the questions I have for Ansi. As I mentioned in the intro, we have had quite a lot of developments. We've had the state capture reports come out. Quite a lot has changed. I wanted to ask you, will there be an updating of King 4? And if so, what do you think the timing, what timelines would you look at if there was to be an update of King 4?
So my short answer is there will definitely have to be an update. We cannot have an update to the Companies Act, which will also affect certain governance provisions, and then not have King 4 keep pace with it. There's a lot of development internationally with regards to both sustainability and environmental matters such as climate change. So we need to keep pace with all of these developments, and we need to remain relevant, otherwise we will lose our purpose. So yes, definitely there will need to be an update. The timing of the update will depend very much on when all of these major developments I've just mentioned too, on how they progress and when that is finalized. I suppose what is in question is not whether we're going to update, but the extent to which we will be updating. When we wrote King 4, we were very careful not to go down rabbit holes of detail. We tried and keep King 4 as high level as possible so that we could extend its lifetime. We deal with the detail and certain specific issues through practice notes and through guidance notes, as some of the people in the audience would no doubt have noticed. And my opinion is that we will probably persist with this approach, dealing with matters at a very high level, at a principled level, and at the level of the most important practices, and then leave the detail to practice notes and to guidance. And we believe that the benefit of that is that the last thing we want to do is to make it difficult for companies to apply corporate governance and to cause huge disruptions. So if we can achieve our aim by as little disruption as possible, I think that's a satisfactory outcome.
Thanks, Ansi. That actually sort of was leading me to my other question about whether King 4 is still suitable for the current environment in which we work. You'll see Simo's long statement and then peppered with a few questions about multiple layers of accountability and oversight structures on SOEs, from boards, parliamentary portfolio committees, scope, Parliament itself, and even cabinets are unable to prevent state capture in South Africa. Could King 4 have stopped this and got these structures to do their work and hold fallible individuals? I see Richard having a laugh. Richard, you smiling? Would you like to have a stab at that, or leave it for Ansi to answer?
Ansi, if she'd like to, can have a go. She's been quoted in the press around that, around those specific aspects. Particularly, maybe I can open the door in relation to the nomination or selection process around boards, which is fundamental to King, ethical and effective leadership, which is what Mohammed alluded to. So as I say, opening that door in the selection and appointment process, if King was followed in that regard, maybe it would have had an impact. And I mean, I think, in fairness, well, now Chief Justice Zondo, he recognized that in the report. But Ansi, do you want to take it further down the line?
No, I agree. But the problem with state capture was that I really like how the Zondo reports explain it. They say that there were three categories. There were the instigators, and those were people who intentionally set out to deceive and to commit fraud and corruption. And then there were those who followed, and then there were those who resisted. So, I mean, if we then look at King 4's influence with respect to these three categories, I think as far as the instigators are concerned, there's nothing that King 4 or any piece of legislation or any code, regardless of what it had said, could have done to move these people from the path that they were on. They had the intent to defraud. They had that they wanted to benefit themselves or other parties, and that's the road that they were on, and they weren't going to be influenced by legislation or codes or rules or whatever. As far as the resistors are concerned, I think where King 4 plays a role here, because the purpose of governance structures are to serve as checks and balances. And if these structures work properly, then it gives the resistors a chance to resist effectively. That is, if you have a more normal situation where all the structures are not overcome with the instigators. And then as far as the followers are concerned, again, like with the resistors, I feel that King 4 holds up a standard of what should be in place, how things should be done. But sometimes you have to have the courage to uphold that standard, and you have to, instead of being a follower, you must become a resistor. And if you don't have that courage, or it is somehow too difficult for you, or you sidelined, you are removed from your position and put on suspension, like many people have been, then of course it comes to naught. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is, I think King 4 has a role to play, and legislation has a role to play, but its role when people set out to deceive or to commit fraud or corruption, its role is hampered, and it becomes very difficult. I know that from personal discourse, Julie, that Mohammed also has strong views on this particular issue, which I think will be worthwhile to be heard.
Yes, please, Mohammed, go ahead.
Thanks, Ansi. I think this question has been asked, and I'll come to the issue of state-owned entities, but it's been asked generally about corporate failures. And I suppose the starting point is a simple answer that says, well, in a lot of the examples we see, the principles of King 4 were just not followed. What gets complicated is if you look, for example, at Eskom's integrated report during 2017, for example. If you look at Steinhoff's reports for the period 2011 to 2016, by the way, the King Committee issued a guidance note on lessons learned from corporate failures. You'll see there that one of the observations made is one of the entries is the same exact entry around ethics and how ethics is dealt with every single year for 5 years. So what's common is if you look at the Eskom integrated report, they say they apply at the time King 3, and they've got all the things in place. Steinhoff report said exactly the same. But if we go back, and this is the issue Ansi just raised, it's about the fundamental behind King is around mindful application. It's about the ethical leadership, effective leadership. As soon as you derogate it to a tick box way of complying, you then circumvent what King is really about. And what you see, both in the Eskom example I've used, in the Steinhoff example I've used, is the claim to apply King, but it's almost in a tick box fashion, or it's definitely in a tick box fashion, but the fundamental principles, lead effectively, lead with integrity, accountability, transparency, all of that's not applied. So I would argue that if you apply King the way it's supposed to have applied, it would have worked in Steinhoff and it would have worked in the SOE kind of examples we're using. The one exception, I suppose, or caveat is we must understand and accept that we were dealing with an abnormal situation, and Ansi has alluded to it. So you have checks and balances in governance. So you have a committee, then you have a board, and you have assurance, and you have audit, and in SOEs, you have parliamentary oversight and the ministerial oversight, all of these things. But it's unprecedented that you have such a spectacular failure at every single level of governance, right throughout the chain. And I don't know if we'll ever get a situation like that, but reverse that and say, how do you design a governance system where every single check and balance you put in place is undermined? And it would be extremely difficult to do so. So on the one hand, I'm saying that the checks and balances that were referred to didn't work because of this catastrophic failure right up the chain. But more importantly, had the fundamental principles of King been applied, they would have worked. They would have worked to stop the problem. The other aspect I just want to bring to this is because all of us always look at some of these things in terms of the collective, the board. What did the board do? What did the organization do? So if we take an example of SOEs again, given the question that's been raised, if you look at something that needs to go from a procurement committee to a board and then get shareholder approval in terms, of the PFMA from the minister, you have divisional committees that exist. You may have in that chain of a procurement decision, maybe 40 people involved. I don't for 1 minute believe that every single one of those 40 people were the instigators or had, nefarious agendas. I think in that you may have had 2 or 3 or 5 people, and the rest of the people around were generally not comfortable. Some may have been followers and just followed. Others may have been resisted and, taken out of the system, and others uncomfortable, but assumptions of what one's role is in the governance structure. So once you assume that as an individual, I don't have the accountability to raise my voice and voice objection to something because I can use the excuse that my boss or the leaders believe this is the way to go. I don't agree with it, but my boss said so. That's when you also start having these fault lines and the governance checks and balances not working. So you start having, the point I'm making is when you look at all of these principles, they start with us as individuals to lead ethically and effectively. And what does that mean? Ansi's referred to it. It's about independence, and it's about courage, and it's about application of your own mind. You can't sit at a committee, have a decision that's taken that you vehemently disagree with because it's unethical, it's unlawful, and then say, well, I made a point, but my bosses wanted to do something different. That's not a discharge of your fiduciary duty as an employee. And I think until we start recognizing that each of us as individuals, that's where the change starts in getting these things right. That's how the principles of King will start applying to these organizations, and then we can have better governance.
Thanks, Mohammed. The questions are coming in quite thick and fast now, so I'm going to jump around a little bit and I'm going to change the direction in which we're going. 2 of our audience members have raised the ISO 37000 document that has been published. And they're wondering now, the ISO 37000, it's the governance of organizations. Does this impact on the relevance of King 4? But before I go to Richard to answer this question, I'm just going to let our audience members know that there is a guidance paper produced by the IODSA on this that compares King 4 and the ISO 37000, and it's available on our website. Also, because this is a member event, I can happily tell that tell all the members present, you can also download our app and have it at your fingertips on your phone. I'm just going to now post the link to this document in the chat so you can see it there. You can also download the app and access all our documents and papers off your mobile phone or your tablet. Okay, so Richard, tell us about ISO 37000 and what its impact is on King 4.
Okay, I responded in the chat room saying that comparison, which you just alluded to, was done. And what essentially came out of that in terms of the conclusion was that King 4 is still relevant, and you need to look at the two guidance documents in context. I mean, King is still the leading governance code, certainly in South Africa. If you look at the fact that it's embedded in our jurisprudence, it's part of the common law. So you already have that aspect to it, and its broad approach. If you look at ISO 37000 and you read through that comparative guide, what struck me, I was part of the review team that looked at it, and what struck me was you could see in the period from when King was drafted to last year when ISO 37000 was released, you could see some of the accent, put it that way, on certain things. If I think about purpose, you know, purpose being the bedrock of what companies are all about today. I mean, it's not lacking in King. So a lot of what is in ISO 37000, there's not a gap in King. But as I say, it's probably been accentuated in ISO 37000. Also, if you look at ISO 37000 and you start focusing in then on risk, you need to look at the other relevant ISO guides. It's also drafted at a fairly high level. So, I mean, the view is, and you know, view I supported that the one complements the other. And as I say, from a primary perspective, in South Africa, I would contend that, you know, South Africa, the King Code is still the leading code. Obviously, you know, again, you need to look at your organization's situation. Are you a global organization? You know, you can compare, you can ask the same question in relation to, well, I see we have got delegates from other countries. Well, I sit in Botswana or I sit in whatever. Which is better, OECD or King? And again, you need to look at the perspectives or context. There's certain organizations that favor OECD that might require you to demonstrate that you've applied a relevant governance code. So I hope that, you know, gives you a sort of broad overview. But again, just to perhaps highlight what came through in the review, there are no glaring omissions. Probably, say, in reading ISO, there are things that have, say, been accentuated that probably if King was redrafted tomorrow, one would bring those things through in terms of highlighting them or making their relevance better known. But there's nothing lacking in King 4 at principal level, you know, at this stage. Hope that answers the question, Ingrid and the others.
Thanks, Richard. Mohammed, you recently worked with a small task team looking at key drivers that are changing things, changing the governance landscape. And it ties into a question that one of our audience members has asked. They said, also an interesting update over and above the issues around climate change. Would the governance of the fourth industrial revolution, especially areas of artificial intelligence and autonomy of machine learning and agency, any thoughts on this, or would this be a specialist field? Do you want to share your thoughts on that and your learnings from the work that you had done when looking into these areas where governance may be changing?
So, Julie, you've raised two different aspects. The one is climate change, and the other is artificial intelligence. So let me deal with the generic point first, and then I'll deal with each of those. So I think the first thing that we try to do with King 4 is to give guiding principles that could be enduring for as long as possible. Because I think we need to, we believed that, and it goes back to the legislation point, the more prescriptive you are, the more short-term whatever guidance you provide will be relevant. Secondly, is if you aspire to the highest level of principles, ethical and effective leadership, circumstances may change. And the question then at each juncture is this: how within these circumstances do I apply ethical and effective leadership? Okay, so if I start answering the question to say, are there huge gaps in King 4? I don't think so. For example, if you look at the issue of climate change, we deal with environment in a number of ways. So it's part of corporate citizenship. It's part of, so principle 3 for corporate citizenship, it's dealt with as part of some of the practices. 14D, we deal specifically with the environment. If we look at the issues around reporting, risk, integrated thinking, we say a part of integrated thinking is sustainable development. So if you look at the principles, they certainly are there. There's enough guidance there to apply yourself, you know, for governing bodies to apply themselves, apply King and apply those principles to issues around environment, ESG issues, and climate change. What I do accept is, given that it was written in 2016, there have been different drivers, there are different awareness at the moment about climate change issues. A lot of companies are talking about decarbonization targets. A lot of that is happening. And in that context, I think there may be some contextual issues that King may need to deal with. There may be some freshening of language, that sort of thing. But all I'm saying is, until a decision is made or until that is done, there is enough in terms of the principles as King stands today to give guidance on climate change, not in specific terms, but certainly from a principle perspective. And then it's supported by some of the guidance papers that we've issued around specifically climate change and sustainable development. If we get to the issue of artificial intelligence, I think in one breath the answer is similar, where we talk about the governance of risk, the governance of technology. Those issues have been covered before. I think, you know, when we started looking at some of the things and some of the developments around artificial intelligence, the learning, how, you know, there's talk about developments where if you start as a director, start reviewing your board pack in particular apps, that the machine starts learning what you as a director start looking for and actually guide you the next time you start reviewing papers, that sort of thing. There's a lot of development there. I think, again, there's no gap in principles, but the issue we will need to start thinking about as we go forward, for me, the critical issue is, how is all of these developments, this innovation in technology and artificial intelligence, going to change how we govern in the sense of how we allocate our time? If I can use what is, I suppose, it might not be a relevant example, but in theory, it's at least possible. If the tools that are already developed for auditing, for assurance, for monitoring are becoming so advanced and so reliable, you know, how much attention should a board be paying, and how do you pay the best attention in terms of those functions of governance? Is it the same as we do it today? Do you do it differently with the aid of those tools so that more application of mine is on the judgment issues and less on trying to double check detail and information and so on? So those are the areas, Julie, where I think we're going to see a change in how boards govern, in how leadership deals with some of these issues, and trying to find the right balance between mindful application and judgment and using these tools to their maximum ability, so that you don't have leadership spending time on things where other tools or products could assist. The other big issue is around the ethics of AI, which I think, there's a lot written about it. It's about how are the choices that seem neutral being designed into these algorithms that help decision making, and the leadership and governing bodies oversight over who makes those choices, how those choices are made. Are they fair? Are they equitable? Are they inbuilt unconscious biasness in all of these choices? So we must, the new world is going to be using a lot of these algorithms. They've already been used in various scenarios to make decisions about financing. But do we leave that to others to deal with, about criteria, how they developed, how they built? Or is this an area where the leadership and the governing bodies need to play a far greater role in ensuring that you have fair outcomes and equitable processes that deliver the results?
Thanks, Mohammed.
Perhaps,
Go ahead, Richard.
sorry, Julie. Perhaps I can just add to that what Mohammed's been saying, and we had quite extensive discussions around that at the in that little, whatever it was, thought leadership group. And at the end of the day, you know, if you default back to who is responsible and accountable, and I made the sort of point there that ultimately it's the board, it's the directors. So whatever you rely on doesn't really matter, because you have to make an informed decision, whether it's you relying on algorithms, whether you're relying on, I mean, if you have a look, you know, through history, we went through mechanization. If you suddenly relying on processes and so forth, you need to understand them. You need to understand the risks, because ultimately you will still be held accountable. We haven't got to a stage where you can delegate your responsibility or accountability and say, well, you know, I was use the example. If you look up the shareholder, well, the devil made me do it, and you know what? It was actually carried out by management and robotics. I'm just the middleman. The middleman in law, in other words, the board, needs to actually understand what is going on in the business, what is going on within the business, whatever it may be. So as I say, that new areas are challenging. There've been challenging areas in the past, and boards will just have to realign and rethink that ultimately, whatever is happening within the business, ultimately you will be held responsible and accountable. So again, I guess that just reinforces the notion you need to have competent board members in place in order to, you know, satisfactorily discharge their duties.
Thanks, Richard.
If I can just add, sorry, not on the artificial intelligence issue, but the point I'd like to just make on the climate change issue is, I think one of the challenges for leadership today, in addition to dealing with the things we're doing to try and decarbonize, setting targets, reporting, being transparent about that, looking at performance and strategy in terms of the triple context, it's also how far ahead you're looking. So if you look, and if I can use water as an example, we have a lot of organizations who are mindful of the need to use the scarce resource wisely, to use it as efficiently as possible, starting to report on water consumption, starting to report on measures to actually make them more efficient, like we've been doing with energy as well. I think what I haven't seen enough of, and this is one of the challenges as we look forward, is are any of these boards, is leadership grappling with the choices we're going to face in the next 5, 10, 15 years? I don't know. Where the choice is not so much make myself as efficient as possible and use the water that I can get as efficiently as possible, but the new choice is how much water will be allocated for industrial use, how much will be allocated for food, how much will be allocated for household, for hygiene. Those are tough, difficult choices. And until we have new technology that changes, if you look at the scarcity of water and what we're going to be facing in the future, and Richard is smiling, he's from Cape Town, so he'll tell you, how they experienced the drought a few years ago. But I'm saying that as leadership, we're not yet grappling with those future questions. There are going to be different choices we need to face as we face the climate change challenges. So today we're making it in almost a business as usual, slightly abnormal environment. I think as soon as you start talking about how much water can you use for food and how much can you use to produce widgets, we're going to have a whole different dynamic and responsibility as to how we move forward to grow the economy for sustainability as well.
Thanks, Mohammed. I just want to remind everyone, Noxolo and Bongani, to post your questions into the Q&A if you want it addressed by our panel. So those are future questions or questions about the future. I want to bring it back to a more practical right now question. Two of our members have asked, our audience members have asked this question. And Richard, I'm going to put them to you as one of our IODSA facilitators. Is it good governance for the chair to chair one of the committees? And that follows on with the next question is, where the board has constituted a board committee, can the committee be deemed to make decisions for the board? Or is it correct that the committee's role is to deal with the monitoring and oversight where the board retains the function of approval and decision making? For example, setting policies, risk appetite, contract approval, and the like. Would you like to just answer those two governance questions for us?
Okay, I'll deal with I actually saw the second question first. I think that was from Ashley, but the first question you posed around the chair of committees and can the chair of the board be put on various committees. And if you read the detail within King, it gives guidance as to whether or not it recommends the chair should be a member of a certain committee. In respect to the nomination committee, it says chair should be a member of, should be the chair of the nomination committee, maybe obviously a member as well of that committee. The audit committee, no. So as I say, King does give the detail, it gives guidance on that. And again, the philosophy behind that, or the underlying principle, is to promote independence and a prevention of or to encourage a dilution of power. In other words, to prevent a power block in any particular sphere. In other words, the chair or within a particular committee. So that's the intention behind it. And as I gave you two examples. Audit committee, no. If you look at UK guidance, they're very much focused on the independence aspect. Chair of the board shouldn't be on the shouldn't even be a member of the audit committee. I think they've now relaxed that, but certainly shouldn't chair the audit committee. But you need to look at the design and structure of what these committees are all about. What is the primary focus of the audit committee? It's to provide independent oversight. So why can't the chair be, say, a member of the SEC or the risk committee? It's got a different function, different focus. Again, REM, particularly in the private sector, the REM committee is there to provide as much independent or objective oversight to the executive remuneration. So I think that deals with the one question. The other question that was asked around delegation to committees. I think you have to look at it from two perspectives. One is if it is a statutory committee and you have statutory responsibilities, in other words, the SEC or the audit committee, the audit committee members have a statutory duty to discharge those responsibilities. So they need to recommend, I'm just giving an example, recommend the appointment of the external auditors, determine the fee and recommend the fee to the shareholders and so forth. So they're empowered to make the decision. You do get committees where they have delegated responsibilities. So you need to look at the delegation. Is it a committee that merely makes recommendations back to the board? Or in a lot of companies today, you find that the audit committee and the SEC will be a hybrid. In other words, they have statutory responsibilities and they have delegated responsibilities. So in terms of the decision-making power, you need to look at which particular aspect it is. I've given, an example of audit committee where they do have the power. Perhaps to give an example of an audit committee where they would not have the power is the approval of the financial statements, which would be reserved for the audit committee. Remuneration committee as well. You set the mandate in terms of are you allowing that committee to make the decision on your behalf, or is it a recommendation that comes back to the board? And then determining whether or not you make that delegation, I think it's important to realize what is the potential impact of that decision on the organization, because ultimately, if the committee makes the decision on your behalf, you're still going to be held. If it's a delegated function, you as a board member are still going to be held responsible and accountable for the decision made by the committee. Obviously, the court would look at the relevant facts and circumstances around the delegation. I trust that takes care of both those questions.
Yes, thanks, Richard. Auntie's going to join us again in a second. She's just had a connectivity issue. I want to go back now. As I said, I was going to jump. Before Mohammed, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, do you want me? There's I see some questions about the legal issue again and about holding people accountable and the judicial system. I thought I'll talk about that, but
yes,
before I do, if I can just add to what Richard has spoken about the committees. So in King 4, we've given guidance around committees, and it's important that they're structured well. It's an important part of good governance. But if I can just say this, we mustn't get detracted by form over substance. So there's legislation that determines, the requirement for certain committees and how they're composed. There are guidance and the best practice issues we've raised in King about who sits on what committee, and that's to avoid, well, I'm using the word conflict, but it's just around in order to ensure the best independence, oversight, and for a committee to fulfill its role effectively. It doesn't make sense for the chairman to chair every single committee of the board. You want a different perspective. You want different things to flow up to the board. I think the point I was going to make is at times we become obsessed with which committee should we have, which function should fit into which committee. And King 4 was deliberate, and it said that you need a committee that deals with risk, whether it's in the same, or attached to another committee. And there was a reason for that. Is the fundamental question is, are we governing risk well? Are we governing remuneration well? Are we governing, all the different areas well? And what processes do we put in place to make sure that a particular area is well governed? And you might find that adding a committee helps you govern and make you more effective. And that should be the focus. And all I'm saying is sometimes we become disproportionately focused on form rather than substance, subject to legislative requirements and best practice guidelines. On the legal and issue around legislating King, the legal issues, perhaps the one point I should add to what I explained earlier, and I think Ansi and Richard have also dealt with the issue around, because you have issue around principles, flexibility, it needs to be determined within a particular context. It's very difficult to legislate for these things. But if you look at the duties of directors, and Ansi referred to it, so it's about, acting in the best interest of the company in good faith with due diligence. So when you start talking about care, skill, and diligence, the test in our law and in many jurisdictions is about what would the reason, and the test is in the Companies Act, about what would the reasonable director have done with your knowledge and skill. So it's an objective and a subjective test. But when you deal with what is reasonable and a reasonable standard, and there have been judgments to this effect already, where the courts have had regard to best practice codes, and in particular King, and said, well, these are what is regarded as reasonable steps that a director should have taken. So what happens is, although it's not legislated, some of the principles and practices in King find their way into judicial precedent by the courts affirming that a director in discharging his duties properly should have actually did X, Y, Z, or did what the standard prescribed, or did what King says is an appropriate standard to behave or how to lead. So that's one way that some of the principles, some of the practices in King find its way into law. And once it becomes part of the case law, it's law as with statute. It's effective, it's legally binding. The other part of the question was, what about the judiciary, and can't they hold people to account? As I've explained earlier, we've got an array of legislation that already is in place that can hold all of the parties who acted contrary to interest of the companies they served on, can hold them to account, and they can be charged criminally, can be held liable civilly. So all of that is available. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Mohammed, for that extensive response. Welcome back, Ansi. I'm going to jump in with a question straight away for you. We were going to the practical issues and then forward-looking issues. And the recent proposed changes to the Companies Act, it leads back to a question that Richard had asked once before about what is meant by a balanced board. What role does employee representation play within the board composition? And what experts do you need on a board? And that ties into the question that came in from one of our audience members, again, referencing the company law proposed changes, considering that company law is considering requirements for worker representation on company boards and the extension of directors' duty in favor of a multiplicity of stakeholders, as opposed to the present position of directors' own duties to the company. Is the stakeholder inclusive part being taken seriously given recent corporate issues in this space? And they've cited examples such as Lonmin and mining communities. So would you like to just give your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Julie, and apologies for my unexpected dropping off. So it's a very interesting thing, or interesting notion, having stakeholders on the board, and almost what that speaks to is who's watching the watchman. So the board is supposed to exercise oversight over management, and now the feeling is, well, there should be somebody else also watching over what the board does, and that the board takes into account and what it needs to consider, and that the board is accountable to stakeholders, and having other stakeholders on the board is seen as a mechanism that could address this. But when I'm asked questions about the best board composition, I still stand by what we said in Principle 7, which is that you need diversity, you need the right knowledge, skills, and experience, and you need independence. That's the mix of ingredients that you require. I think what is often missed with board composition is that as a minimum, and now I'm going to diminish it, but I'll expand on this. As a minimum, you need to understand governance. And I'm afraid to say that many of our directors think they understand governance, but I'm not sure that it's true. So as a board, you need to be able to, for example, explain what a proper enterprise-wide risk management should look like, what its attributes are, how it should be set up, what it should deliver, how you then question what it delivers. Many directors can't explain that to you. Same with a compliance system. How should it work? How should it be set up? How should it function within the risk system? Let's talk about internal audit. As a non-executive director, you need to understand, and as an executive director for that matter, you need to understand what is the function of internal audit vis-a-vis external audit. What is the function of internal audit within a combined assurance system? How can you leverage internal audit to be truly your eyes and ears on the ground as the board? How does the internal audit functions within the combined assurance model? if you can't answer these questions, you have no business being a director. And so I think many directors become directors on the basis of their technical proficiency. If I refer to technical proficiency, I mean if they've spent their career as an engineer, they become a director because they're very proficient in becoming an engineer. But then they don't supplement that with the professional non-executive director expertise. And non-executive directors, we must remember, are at a huge disadvantage because they spend very limited time at the company vis-a-vis executive directors. How do you hold to account management if you only spend, let's say, 10 days of a year at a company? How do you overcome the risk that management either intentionally lies or tries to deceive you, or I think what is more common, if that management just makes errors in judgment and that the board doesn't pick up on it? How do you overcome that disadvantage, that asymmetry of knowledge between what non-executive directors have and what executive directors have? That you do by understanding corporate governance and how you leverage risk, internal audit, your whole governance system to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, that I'm answering, I'm giving you a long-winded answer to your question, Julie, but for me, that is where the stakeholder representation model falls flat. Because a stakeholder, let's say an employee representative sitting on a board, will not have that governance expertise and will not necessarily be interested in acquiring that expertise because that is not necessarily a career choice. Or even if it is, by virtue of its nature, an employee representative will probably not sit on the board for the longer term. It will be something that is rotated every 2 or 3 years. The other challenge with stakeholder representation is how do you balance when you come to the board with a vested interest, namely as an employee, how do you balance that interest vis-a-vis your duty to the company? Because when you sit at the board, your duty is to the company, not to the employees who nominated you. And I'm using employees now as the example of the stakeholder representative. The other issue is that we assume that when you have an employee representative, that person represents employees. But how can one person represent the varied interests of employees at various levels in various departments and business units and so on in the operations? And then the last point in this respect is how do you now make room for all of the stakeholders around the boardroom table? You cannot. Okay, so now you have to prioritize. How do you prioritize? So you choose only employees, and what about communities? And what about customers? Do you leave them out? So I think it sounds as if stakeholder representation would be like a really great solution, but to my mind, it isn't. We should rather address the root of the problem and make non-executive directors better professional non-executive directors. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Ansi. Mohammed, as part of Ansi's answer there, she mentioned how one way to sort of safeguard against governance failures is for directors to leverage the governance system within their organization. And that ties in with a question that's come in. the question is, what could Eskom, Steinhoff, or maybe even some of the other another boards, for example, Sasol with their Lake Charles Chemicals project, what could they have done where risk is concerned to avoid the catastrophes they suffered? Especially since these organizations may have believed that they have competent people driving or managing their potential risks or their risks. Would you like to maybe give your thoughts on that?
I think, Julie, there's two aspects here. So the one is risks, and is the governance of risk robust? We always talk about this when COVID-19 came and whether people foresaw something like that happening. And the way to do that is, I think we've dealt with that in King 4. It's to make sure that you have robust processes, that you interrogate the processes, that you get some sort of different views, that you apply your mind to what's ahead, and think about different scenarios. So you have various processes of risk. The danger to avoid is, all of it being in-house, all of it not exposing blind spots, and that's how you manage and deal with risk. So it's around asking the naive questions, being mindful about what's put before the board, and in a sense challenging the issues that are put before the board, because that's important as part of the governance structure. You have a different dimension to this if you included Eskom, in that that's where you're talking about people who were deliberately trying to steal and were involved in corruption and so on. That's a difficult one, because I think I've answered that already, saying that if people were ethical, if the checks and balances worked, that would never have been allowed. If the principles in King were applied, that would never have applied. And I think because people felt, well, it's not my problem, it's someone else's problem. You had good people who I think just didn't speak up as loudly as they should. And for the few who were courageous enough to speak up, I mean, they were sidelined. But, it's about the robustness of your governance, the governance of risk in the organization.
Thanks, Mohammed. Ansi, I want to ask you, does the King Committee engage with other African countries on the implementation or rollout of King 4 across the continent?
So, not formally, Julie. We worked through the IFC about just after King 4 was released, to go on a road show to other countries in Africa to explain to them why we embarked in South Africa upon King 4, what it sets out to do, and to specifically talk about the outcomes-based approach as opposed to slavishly following all of the recommendations in King 4 as a tick box. So to emphasize these different philosophies and approaches, and it was very well received, and I know for a fact that there were African countries that brought out codes subsequently that incorporated some of these King 4 aspects into their own codes.
Thanks, Ansi.
Julie, while I have the microphone, so to speak, I just want to add a little bit to what I've said before and to what Mohammed has said. And I think that, a board that does its job looks at stakeholders and looks at what happened at Sasol and so on, and Eskom and so on, should look at all of these three things through the lens of risk, exactly as Mohammed has said. And risk has two aspects to it. It has an opportunity aspect to it, and it's got a downside to it. Now, I said earlier that we should go back to root causes rather than trying to put plasters on it. So rather than putting stakeholders on boards to do a job that actually non-executive directors should do, professional non-executive directors, let me say, boards should look differently at risk management. If as part of your risk management, you don't take into account the needs, interests, and expectations of your stakeholders, and you don't respond to it appropriately, then you're in trouble. If there are certain projects at your company that isn't part of your risk management framework, and that you don't keep an eye on as the board, and that you don't understand where the specific flashpoints are, then it's difficult to exercise oversight. So that's what I mean by addressing the root causes, that we should leverage the system to exercise oversight rather than trying to look for these quick fixes. I just wanted to add that in there.
Thanks, Ansi. Richard, you sit on the CRESA committee, the Code for Responsible Investment, and our Principle 17 of the King Code says that the governing body of an institutional investor organization should ensure that responsible investment is practiced by the organization to promote the good governance and the creation of value by the company in which it invests. Do you think there should be more guidance on the responsibility of shareholders and investors?
In the King Code, I guess that's what you're asking. I think, Julie, you know, when we looked at Principle 17, there was a fair amount of debate as to, well, first of all, who's King drafted for? King's not drafted for shareholders, it's drafted for the leadership, the boards. And so should you bring in aspects around shareholders? And if you go right back to King 3, and you have a look at the structure of King 3, and as I say, focused again on the leadership and on directors, there was comment at that time that more needs to be said about shareholder governance and the role of shareholders, which is critically important in relation to, you know, particularly listed organizations, although in a lot of unlisted organizations that would equally apply. But so what evolved was that King made a decision that, to say, the code is focused for directors at that particular point in time, and that gave rise to the birth of CRESA in what was 2011, where you had a code for institutional investors as defined, which covers the whole value chain from the asset managers right through to the asset owners, the pension funds, and so forth. So when you look at King 4, King 4 does deal with, as I say, through Principle 17, it deals with institutional investors, as you've just outlined. Furthermore, if you have a look at the supplements and you look at the retirement fund supplement, again, that is one of the critical institutional investors. And as I say, this particular supplement dealing with the 16 or 17 principles. But I think what's important to realize that you have institutional investors that sit outside the company. They have no fiduciary duty as such towards the company. The shareholders in Steinhoff have no fiduciary duty towards Steinhoff. They may have fiduciary contractual duties to the pension funds or to the asset owners per se. That is a different matter. So what, as I say, what is dealt with in the shareholders code is slightly different. They I won't go through the 5 principles, but just in terms of the first principle, the main focus of the institutional investors is to drive what they call ESG, environment, social governance aspects in the investment strategy within the organizations that they link with. And there immediately you see the link between institutional investors on the one hand, and companies have been told you need to look, Ansi referred to triple bottom line, and we talk about triple context. We're now starting to talk about, ESG. Companies are meant to be adopting that approach, that lens, particularly in relation to risk management. So this is where the alignment needs to be, that you have institutional investors engaging with the companies. So what more could be said in King 4? I mean, if you have a look at the comments on King 4 at the stage, there was support that that principle was brought in to encourage institutional investors as defined to promote good governance in the investee companies. From our perspective, it was useful to create the link and raise the brand awareness around CRESA. Just on CRESA, for those of you who perhaps not aware, there has been a process over the last year of drafting CRESA 2, and the proposed launch of CRESA 2 is imminent, in fact, next month. So watch the space on that side. So there's a lot happening in that space. I think the last thing I should cover off, though, on the question of the fiduciary duties and who is responsible ultimately in a company. I guess some of the practicalities are, if you look at, from a governance point of view, institutional investors are being encouraged to engage with companies and say, what are you doing around your board composition? What are you doing around REM? In terms of best practice governance, if you look at King 4, they're given the opportunity, should be given the opportunity to vote on remuneration policies, the implementation report, a non-binding vote that then moves you into the space of engagement. So from a legal point of view now, there moves afoot to introduce a binding vote. And the question, I guess, is if boards are accountable as they are in law, how much power should you give the shareholders? And as Ansi's alluded to the fact that only one stakeholder, how much additional power should you be giving to the shareholders? I've given you one example to say vote on remuneration policies, because ultimately those shareholders can walk away from the meeting, they can dispose of the shares. They may not be your shareholders the following day, and say they have no duty towards the company. So that's the one thing you deal with. And also, I guess going forward, we also need to look at the aspect of, encouraging so-called ESG votes. In other words, this is what, as a shareholder, this is a proposal we're putting forward at the AGM, that boards should adopt, let's say, new carbon emission targets. We don't agree with what you've got. We agree that, or we believe that you should revise them, and that is put forward to the board. But again, in law, who ultimately needs to make that decision? The board. So that is, from a legal point of view, you have the accountability as a board member. From a shareholder perspective, you want to encourage the shareholders to engage, to as I say, drive ESG issues. But there is the challenge of aligning this. And I always think back to, how much power should you give to shareholders? And putting you in a spot here, Ansi, but you once wrote in a press article, and I recall because I used it at the launch of King 4, was if boards and remuneration committees were actually doing their jobs properly, and you had competent directors or competent committee members, would it be necessary for those shareholders to actually vote on those aspects? So, Julie, I'll leave it there and see if there are any more questions around that. But certainly it's a sensitive question at the moment, given that there is an intention to give more power to shareholders, particularly around remuneration aspects. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. In your answer, you touched on ESG issues. And I wanted to ask Mohammed, you also wear an IRC working group hat as well as a King Committee hat. Do you think that King 4 says enough about ESG issues?
Julia, I think I answered the question earlier when I said I don't think there's a gap. Because in the issues around sustainable development, environment, and so forth, I think the issues are covered. If you look at, some of the, as I said, the language and the focus today, there may be a case for saying we need to change and refresh some of that, but we also need to read it in context with the guidance document we've issued. Insofar as the reporting aspect is concerned, there's a lot of, and Ansi's alluded to it, there's a lot of developments around reporting on sustainability issues, various standard setters, consolidating the issues around standards, what do you report, audience, issues like that. And I think that may require that some clarification or updating is required, whether by guidance notes and update, we can't tell at this stage. But I think there have been significant developments in the reporting space that will mean that we need to look and perhaps give more guidance on some of the reporting issues. We've seen the JSE issue, their sustainability guidelines for reporting on climate change and sustainability. So there's a lot of developments in that space, which we'll have to look at. The one thing, Julie, while I'm have the floor, if I can just raise, there's a very interesting question in the chat around the issue around the listings in South Africa shrinking with global IPO, in a boom. I don't fully understand the article I read to that effect sort of said it's basically to do with our economy and the prospects and where we are. But the note suggests that some of the view that, King report is partly to blame for this. So I don't know if it's meant in the sense that it's not legislated, it's not strong enough. And if that's the point, then I think we've explained that before. And also, if you look at the general regulatory framework to have dealt with sign-off and Tongaat and EOH, the legislation is in place to have dealt with all of those things that have happened. There's nothing has happened in those entities where we say, oh, shucks, this has happened and there's no law, it's not unlawful to do this. Everything is covered by the legislation we have in South Africa and the regulatory environment of the JSE. So in that sense, it's covered. If it's meant in the sense that, and I know a while ago, not recently, but a while ago, there was a lot of noise around investors being put off because of the need for a social and ethics committee and the issues around non-executive directors and the balance on the board and other issues not related to King, for example, BEE and transformation. There were a number of issues like that, but that seemed to have quietened down. And I know recently the JSE has been working on eliminating red tape to try and simplify listings, that sort of issue. I've not, in all of that, picked up recently that our administrative requirements to list, with a problem that's keeping companies from listing in the South African, on the stock exchanges in South Africa. And in fact, if you look worldwide at the moment, there's strengthening of compliance requirements all over the world. If you look at the reporting requirements in the EU, if you look at the SEC has issued these disclosures on sustainability and climate change, which is going to require sign-off by the CE and the CFOs and so on. Those are a lot stricter than what we have in place. So I'm not sure what the question relates to. The only point I want to make is that you're seeing stricter and stricter requirements all around the world around ESG issues and compliance reporting and sign-off in terms of compliance and meeting certain requirements and disclosures.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Julie?
This next question is really, it would really be your opinion on something. Is there any hope that the soon-to-be established Presidential Advisory Council on Corruption will place the mindful application of King 4 when advising the President? I think that's really just a person's wishful thinking, or what, do you have any idea? Do you want to comment on that at all? Okay, let's go on to the next question. How does one, as a board member, ensure that they govern and does not get involved in management? Is there a cutoff point? I think that's a fundamental of the difference between management and the board. But Richard, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, it's a question that's often asked, and it really is a judgmental question. And I think first and foremost, and also playing to what Ansi said earlier about board members actually understanding why they're on the job, or what is their job, and what does acting with due care and skill mean, and that you need to be strategic, you need to implement effective oversight, approve policy, and all those good things. So when do you drop down into getting involved in the operations? And as I say, it's a judgment call. And, you know, from a legal perspective, you obviously as a director have the right to access all information necessary to fulfill your duties. But from a governance perspective, you need to decide what are the, I mean, this is the best advice I can give. You need to decide what are the key aspects in this business that we need to focus on. And Ansi spoke, you know, for a while on risk governance, risk management, understanding the risks in the business. Mohammed, you know, earlier on and then later on in the session spoke about people, and that theme around culture comes through. So as a director, you know, if you sit on the board as a collective, you should decide what information do we require. Ansi alluded to the fact, you know, or 4 board meetings perhaps a year, 4 committee meetings a year. What information do we need at board level? What information do we need at committee level? When do you actually drop down further? Only, I believe, if there is a necessity to do so, if you believe there's an issue with management who actually delegated the authority to run the business. It could be because you either don't trust them, or there has been some event of sufficient magnitude that could cause harm to the company, and then you would step in. But in the ordinary course of business, even during COVID, if you have a look at boards, they did tend to get more involved, have more meetings around, well, what are the key issues we've got to deal with in relation to perhaps change in strategy, what has the risk profile for the organization changed. But I think there's a danger that the minute a company is under pressure, the directors perhaps could delve too far into management or the operations of the company, and it flies in the face of, you know, what they actually employed to do, or what they meant to do. And again, I mean, I always try and context these answers or use the caveat that depends on the size of the organization. In small organizations, quite often it's sort of more hands on deck. But as far as possible, if you look at you know, what is the role of the board and good governance, it's to maintain the strategic view, the foresight, and an oversight of what management are doing. How far you need to delve, that is a judgment call. There's a suspected fraud issue or some other issue, as I say, that's raised its head, then perhaps you need to become more involved. But ordinarily refrain from getting sucked into those operational issues.
Thanks, Richard.
Julie, if I can add to that, but more on a philosophical basis. So Stephen Covey said that the job of leadership is to decide which wall the ladder should be put against, and management is to climb the ladder in an efficient way. And Bob Garrett used the analogy of a motor vehicle, and he said if you're traveling somewhere, the board will decide the vehicle and the destination, and management must ensure that the car is running efficiently and effectively to get to the destination. and you need to report on all of the gauges and how much fuel and so on is being used. And what he calls, when there's asynchronous performance, then that should be reported to board. They should be reporting on the board in terms of, fuel efficiency, all of that. And if ever the objective of meeting the and management chooses then the route to get to the destination. And if ever the objective of the destination, it's, arriving there is threatened, then of course that's a matter for the board to intervene. So those are two analogies, and I think they speak to what Richard has explained in practical terms.
I love your example. Actually haven't heard that one before, but using your example of the motor vehicle.
Not mine, Richard, it's Bob Garrett.
No, Bob Garrett's, but taking that back to the motor vehicle and what I said earlier, if you're not going to meet that objective, or the road that the management is taking, you do not believe, and I'll use terminology, is within the risk appetite of the company with regard to its reputation, then one needs to actually get involved, and that's the point I was trying to make.
Thanks, Mohammed and Richard. Sue wants to know what the panel's thoughts are on shareholders voting against the NED fees to force change at board level. Who would like to weigh in on that?
So, Julie, I think it's the wrong tool for the job. If as a shareholder, you are not happy with who the NEDs are, then you must follow the process as per the Companies Act to appoint or elect new non-executive directors. Non-executive directors should earn a fair fee for the job, and penalizing non-executive directors in terms of their fees is not, I think, the right way to go about it. Again, it's not addressing the matter at the root of it. And that's what we need to do, to address it at the root. If you have the wrong directors, then you have to make sure that you get the right ones in place.
Yeah. So perhaps if I could just add to what Ansi said, and particularly if you look at remuneration structures around NEDs and around executives, how would you penalize an executive? Not by taking something off their salary typically. It would be the non-achievement of the bonus targets. So they would be penalized that they perhaps get a lesser bonus or share allocation. And I think to Ansi's point, if you look at the structure of non-executive fees, directors are typically paid a fee. It's not performance driven. If you're not comfortable, as Ansi alludes to, with the performance of those directors, shareholders have, certain rights, however limited they are, to appoint or remove directors and their mechanisms in that regard. So, I fully support that, as I say, particularly given the type of remuneration structures you typically have in place. Thanks, Julie.
Mohammed, one of our members asks, on the idea of proportionality when applying King 4, how do you suggest managing minority shareholder overreach when good governance is used as an excuse to try exercise control?
Julie, that's a very difficult and generic question. If you just follow the principles that we've been discussing, if you follow the principles in King, there's a role for the board that must act in the interest of the company. So in the example you've used, you could have a shareholder who's short-sighted and wants the company to do something that will benefit that shareholder in the short term. So, it's not the shareholder's role to be involved in those sorts of decisions. The board needs to act in the long-term interests of the company. And if the shareholder is aggrieved or there is something incorrect happening, then you have recourse to the legislative environment to assist and protect minority shareholders. I mean, as part of a board's responsibility, we spoke about this, it's to act in the best interests of the company, but having regard to the interests and legitimate expectations of all stakeholders. So your shareholders, including your minority shareholders, are those stakeholders that you should have regard to. And as long as you believe whatever you're doing is the interest of the company generally, then you should be fine. It's very difficult to answer the kind of question you've asked in a generic sense, because unless we know what the governance concern is that is being raised, may require a different question. But it's not uncommon where a shareholder may have different objectives from what is in the best interest of the company.
Sorry, just perhaps to add to Mohammed's point, that I think just reinforces the notion of independence on boards and balance of powers, and the roles that an independent director would play in terms of, amongst other things, you know, if you act in the best interests of the company, you would be protecting not only the minority shareholders, but other stakeholders as well, because you look at the company in totality, rather than perhaps you know, being a shareholder representative. In law, you could say you're meant to act independently, but having that particular lens or hat on. And I mean, we have seen examples of that, you know, in some of the listed entities, and the tensions in that regard.
So, sorry,
believe that.
I'm sorry, Richard. I missed one aspect of what you said. Did I hear you right when you said the question was linked to proportionality?
Yes.
Because I think that's maybe the wrong application of proportionality, and I think Ansi explained this earlier. I mean, what proportionality says is there are certain practices in King where we say, you know, establish this committee, you know, do follow this practice. But for a particular organization, you may find that you can achieve a similar governance outcome doing it slightly differently. Given that you're not a listed entity, you may want to do it in a slightly different way, and you won't comply with all the practice recommendations, but you still adhere to the principle and you achieve it in a different way. So that's what proportionality says. So in the context of the shareholder, I mean, you're still saying that you must act in the interest of the company. You have the Companies Act itself that provides certain requirements, where you have a sole shareholder and a sole director, and you have certain relaxation of certain requirements in that situation. But other than that, I mean, the board must apply its duties in the interests of the company, and the shareholder has a very, very different limited role in the governance of the company.
Thanks, Mohammed. Okay, a question that's come in from NT. What are the most important differences when one is an NED in a trust, for example, a community trust set up by a mining company, and when one is an NED for a company, besides the reference point being the trust deed versus the MOI? I think the crux of the question is there, what's the difference in the role between those two size organizations? Ansi, would you like to take a stab at that?
I'll take a brief stab at it. So your underpinning governance issues are essentially the same, because remember, governance kicks in when there's the agency risk. In other words, as an investor or an interested party in some other sense, you are reliant on management to look after your interests. It may be an investment, or it may be a non-financial interest. Now, when you're a trust, the beneficiaries of the trust are looking to the trustees in this sense to look after their interests. Now, it may be that it's an investment trust, and the trust has investments with an asset manager, and so the trustees then functions the same as the board in that they oversee the investment by the asset managers, and they would ask report backs on the performance and the principles along which the investment is made. Let's say it's a piece of land, a property, a building, or whatever that's in the trust. Same principle applies. The trustees are looking after the asset, whatever it may be, in the best interest of the beneficiaries of the trust. Yes, and because there's this fiduciary duty, the same issues kick in as what you would have between investors and the board and management. So I think it's there are lots of touch points, and I think it's a good idea to look at the supplement that has to do with non-profit organizations. A lot of it will apply here to trustees as well.
Thanks,
And sorry, if I could just add to that, perhaps what Ansi was saying, particularly if you give the example of an investment trust, that you then should be applying the principles in CRESA in terms of mandating the asset managers or agreeing their mandate and driving ESG principles in terms of good governance. So it all ties together.
So two points that came out from two questions here is a focus on governance and increasing governance knowledge, increasing governance training, and specifically around whether there should be we not train ministers as the main shareholders and SOEs and other parliamentarians on good governance, or should it not be mandatory for them to be trained so that they cannot plead ignorance? Richard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the short answer, yes, but I can't see it happening. I mean, just thinking from an IOD perspective, as opposed to King, it's, been one of their sort of aspirations that whoever is in the governance ecosystem has a sufficient appreciation of what governance is all about. So, I mean, whether or not King, or whether it's King, whether it's IOD, doesn't have any mandate to make things, mandatory. It can only recommend that it believes that either directors should have have sufficient proficiency, or there should be additional disqualifications introduced. And the same when you're looking at the executive authority, whoever they may be, whether it's the minister, the DG, whoever they are. So aspirationally, I mean, that is perfect world. But I think what is incredibly important, if that doesn't materialize, that what we could hope to achieve more in the shorter term is that when the executive authority exercises their judgment in the appointment of or selection and appointment of directors, that they are better placed and better versed in terms of doing a due diligence. And again, it goes back to training or understanding what is required in a particular SOE or company where they're appointing somebody. And again, that came through very strongly in the Zondo reports. That application of mind, but whether or not you're ever going to make, training mandatory. And, often you do hear the comment passed, by boards, particularly in, not just in this country as well, in various other countries through Africa, and in fact elsewhere. I can give example in the Caribbean. I wish our shareholder or the parliamentarians understood governance and what was required to this level. So I don't know if I've given a good answer. I've just tried to paint the picture that we faced with.
Ansi, you wanted to say something? Oh, Mohammed, go ahead.
So you want to go ahead, Ansi?
Thanks, Mohammed. I actually want to refer, Mohammed, to what you've been referring to repeatedly, and that is governance is ethical and effective leadership. And we can easily gloss over it and we think, okay, there's alliteration and it sounds nice, but it's intentionally so ethical and effective leadership. So if you're sitting in a parliamentary oversight committee, it's not enough for you to govern well, to have good intent, or to not to do anything wrong, and then think, well, I'm an ethical leader, so that's good governance. That's not enough. That's where the effective leadership comes from, because you can only be effective when you're competent. And in fact, because others rely on your governance, others' interests depend on it, you can harm others by not governing effectively. My contention is that it's actually unethical to be incompetent and to allow yourself to be incompetent. And I don't understand why we need to make training mandatory. Well, I understand why, but I'll explain my point. I don't understand why individuals, and here I'm getting back to a point that Mohammed has made repeatedly, as individuals, we need to take responsibility. If you sit on a board, if you sit on a trust, if you sit at Parliament, a portfolio committee of Parliament, you better take responsibility yourself for making sure that you have the competency to exercise oversight. Yes, I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll just carry on and on.
Thanks, Ansi. I mean, that's the point I want to make. So I wanted to say, two issues. Firstly, of course, governance training is necessary, and it would be good to improve everyone's abilities and skills and move us towards better governance. The second point I wanted to make, but it's no excuse if you don't know to avoid liability, because it's back to Ansi's point. As having been appointed, you should have taken steps to make yourself competent to do the job. And then it's the point Ansi has made as well, is, someone in the chat made the point that we need to start with the SOEs and start with a good board. Absolutely, you need the right people, proper leadership. But as individuals, you need people who are accountable and responsible and do what is necessary to make them, to equip themselves to do the task diligently and to do it well. And that's what you need. But of course, training is necessary. Whether it's mandatory is a different matter, because if we look at the problems we experienced, I will argue that in a lot of instances, it had nothing to do with knowledge or lack of knowledge of governance and what should or shouldn't happen.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think to a certain extent you have answered this next question, but if there's anything that you want to still add to this, please let me know. Given that one of the governance outcomes is good performance, yet our overall social and economic performance is appalling as a country, do you think our boardrooms overall have done well towards achievement of these governance outcomes, and our shortcomings are from elsewhere only, or should boardrooms do better in this regard?
So, Julie, if I start and I link it to the question that's just been raised about must be accompanied by consequence management. I think insofar as ethical and effective leadership is concerned, we say always that the tone needs to start, right at the top. And the culture then permeates in the organization. And consequence management is important, not just for its punitive effect. It's more important to establish that that's the way we do things around here.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important that you follow through with your values as an organization, and that there are consequences. And it doesn't have to be unnecessarily harsh, or it can be consequences that allows people to grow and learn. But it's important that in an organization, once you set the tone at the top, that people can see that this is the culture, this is the way the board leads, this is what's acceptable in this organization and this is what is not acceptable. And from that perspective, it is crucially important to follow through and be consistent and make sure that there are consequences for transgression of, I'm not talking now just about performance issues, it's about transgression of values of the organization.
Thanks, Mohammed. Nancy, Richard, do you want to weigh in with that, or are your final thoughts? Because we are coming close to the end of our time. Nancy? Richard?
Just perhaps, reinforcing what Mohammed said, and it goes back to where he started about ethical and effective leadership, and it's about people and it's about culture. And, if you look at King, it's in there, the tone at the top. Principle 1, the culture within the organization, it's in there. Principle 2, and then the way you attach to your stakeholders, that's there as well in principle 3. And then if you look at the rest of the report, it actually gives you the tools within which to do all this. You set policies. You then monitor, as Mohammed was saying, if you've got a value system and their policies set around whether it's procurement, whether it's around various other aspects of behavior, you have frameworks, checks and balances to assess your compliance with those particular policies. And that's what really shapes the behavior in an organization. And again, what Mohammed was saying now is so important. It's, how do we do things around here? It's shaping that culture within an organization. And whether you go back to, using the private sector, you go back to a Steinhoff, you go back to a Tongart, and you look right at the top, and then what is driven through the organization, what did the culture look like? And if you are a director, non-executive director, my closing comment, I guess, would be, do you really understand what is going on in the company from a culture perspective? And that is a key aspect to understanding the potential risks in an organization. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Rich, Nancy, any final thoughts?
Julie, I think I just want to emphasize the point that the role of the King Committee and the King reports must be well understood. And that is to put out the guiding standards for corporate governance that supplement the legislation. The King Committee is not a regulation. It can't, a regulator. It can't enforce accountability. The King report operates in an ecosystem. And we've talked about the role of shareholders. We talked about that King 4 provides the guiding standards, but then that presupposes that the boards must learn it, understand it intimately, and apply it. And that presupposes also that there's a value system that underpins the application of governance. So what I'm saying is the governance standards is one aspect. Behavior comes into it, decision making, the values that underpin application. The enforcement is another aspect of it. So I'm very open to hearing, and in fact, I invite any suggestions as to how the guiding standards can be improved. But we mustn't be misguided in thinking that you tweak a governance principle or practice here or there, or you rewrite King 4 and you issue King 5, and then suddenly we won't have corporate collapses. I think we must understand the systemic nature of this problem and stop looking for the quick fixes. This is a systemic fix that needs to happen to address the systemic problem. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. And this brings us to an end of our time together. But before everyone logs off, I want to just say a big thank you to my panel members. I appreciate your giving us your time and your knowledge and your experience. It really is so appreciated, as you can see from the comment section. I'd also like to remind our audience members that the King 4 report is available on our website with our charge to download, as well as the guidance papers and the practice notes. But even easier, on the new member app, you can download the member app onto your phone, have it at your fingertips. It's free for members to download this app and use at any time. You don't have to be in front of your laptop. And I'd just like to also invite your feedback on the session. If you could please scan the QR code and give us your feedback on the session. And we won't be having an Ask the Expert next month. We will be having sorry, that's the wrong slide. But anyway, we won't be having an Ask the Experts next month. We will be having a Social and Ethics Committee webinar on a guidance paper on ethics. But those details will be emailed all to our members. But thank you again, and thank you for joining us. It's been a great afternoon, and I've enjoyed the conversations that we've had. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.